Yeah, we are going to be recording. Robin, do you want to take the lead, or how do we? Because I would like to have just a really kind of authentic conversation, reflecting on some of the stuff, the strides and maybe the drawbacks that South African legislation has experienced post-apartheid, and what the ambitions were maybe, and what the ambitions still are to this very day. So that's really just kind of a brief framework of what the discussion is going to be about. Yeah. Brenda, I hope that that's fine.
That's fine. I'm in your hands.
Yeah, I think it's also worth exploring, the NSP. Obviously, I was watching a lot of your Wise Collection YouTube videos, and so I was just.
Oh, okay.
So the NSP, and I think there was a certain trajectory that was set out when that was envisioned after 2018. But I think that COVID has negatively impacted that. And so how do we like realign ourselves and reapproach this, understanding those limits and those challenges that have surfaced from the pandemic? So if we can also include that, I'd love it.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Girl.
Excellent. Bellis, I see you're with us, but I see that you're silent, muted, and video off. Hi, and thank you as well for facilitating this particular meeting, in terms of just having this discussion. Brenda, I think as just a beginning start off, and we can start. We've already started recording. Robin is recording on her side, so we would just look to let you know of that as well. But just as a beginning kind of entry point into the conversation, I am interested in what feminism means to you, right? So outside of everything else, outside of activism, what does it mean to you? And how does your feminist journey begin? And where does it begin? I'm curious.
All right. And that's a good entry to this conversation. And when individuals or people who hear the word feminism, they want to jump out of their skin because they think it's about us bending our brows and hating on men. And I think when women started many years ago, we're talking 100 years ago, when we were all denied the right to exist and be humane and be seen as human beings, you had many women who wanted to challenge the status quo by radicalism. And the radicalism was about, if you don't recognize that I can and I am a human being with feelings and rights, then I'm going to rebel and demonstrate to you that I can be as violent as you can be, right? Because what we know as nations, as human beings, as we evolved, that as women, because of our gender and the sex, we had been denied many opportunities in society. Right? Society tried to place us in a box and told us that you can only do as we tell you to do, right? When we have decided whether you're welcome to join us onto this table of being in politics, or whether it's business, or whether even in marriage, we will tell you how to behave and conduct yourself even in marriage and in a family. And so you had many women rebelling against that, because that gender, that I am a woman, had a lot of negative connotations attached to it. And that's why many people, when women decided to rebel and raise issues around some of these discriminatory practices, norms, and cultural practices, then were seen to be wanting to be like men. Right? And you gave that label to women as feminists who want to take over the world and behave like men, right? And we've been trying to shift that thinking and be able to demonstrate that feminism is really about equality. For me, it's really about equality. Once you recognize that I'm a human being, irrespective of my gender, irrespective of my social orientation, irrespective of my religion, irrespective of my age, that I am human and I have rights and responsibilities like you do, then we can have a just and fair society. And so for me, feminism is about recognizing that women have got a place and cannot be treated differently from the rest of other human beings in the world. And so all these practices over the years that have centered men and given them the privileges that they enjoy because of the structures that exist in society that have enabled that privilege to continue. And once we challenge that practice, then we are seen to be anti-men, and that's not where we are. It's about recognizing that we are human beings. We have feelings as equally as men, and that we have the same responsibilities and obligations, and afford us that opportunity of equality and equity, and that's all. And that's feminism for me.
And in many ways, just speaking to your point about us having the same responsibilities, traditionally, we've got quite a lot more responsibility in terms of the unpaid work that we do in the home, and in terms of care, being the primary caregiver, which is how we've always been cast in terms of traditional patriarchal roles. And so it's also about acknowledging that and finding ways to not only ease the loads that is placed upon women in terms of that unpaid work, but also to enable women to then be free to be more economically active and to take up economic opportunity.
Absolutely. And precisely because of the structures of society and economies, they are structured in such a way that they continue to perpetuate the narrative that women's place is predominantly at home and in caregiving, and we're not going to recognize that role because once you don't recognize it, you subscribe to the values that's not important, whereas that economy of in caregiving and is quite productive because it leads to some of the many players in the economy to continue to have a productive economy. So the care economy is huge, and we want a recognition of that economy and ensure, because that's where you find many women in the care economy. And the best way to address it and deal with it is to recognize that it exists, and we can't ignore it because of how economies of the world are structured, because they're structured from a very masculine perspective, and you don't connect it to the broader ecosystem of what we talk about when we talk of equality and equity.
Thank you for that, Brenda. And I think revolving around for me, and this is a question I'm going to pose to both yourselves and Robin, revolving for me is the concept of justice, right? So if we think about the different iterations of the feminist movements, whether you're talking about the first wave, the second wave, the third wave of feminism, each and every single wave defined, of course, temporarily by the historical inflections, is always thinking about the question of what is just in the world. And I wonder, a lot of theories of justice have been developed by men. The most contemporary theory of justice comes from Rawls' theory of justice, right? This kind of distributive conception of justice as fairness. And I wonder whether articulating a conception of justice from a feminist perspective could radically reposition our world and facilitate new imaginations of our world. And I wonder if in your conceptions, both of you, you believe that there have been indeed articulations of justice from feminist standpoints that, because of how the world has been structured, as you've indicated, Brenda, have facilitated these silencing moves and erasures that then don't allow those articulations of justice to play out and take center stage within our politics and within our general societal relations.
And I'm going to use examples to demonstrate the point around justice. So if you look at cases of gender-based violence and sexual harassment in particular. And you ask survivors and victims of sexual harassment what justice means to them. Most of the time, without faith, justice means I want to eyeball the perpetrator, the man who inflicted this harm on me, and I want just an acknowledgement that they did that, right? And when you look at how those who have the power and inflict pain and harm on women, how they run away from facing and taking responsibility and accountability for their action, it tells you of how society or societies themselves keep on promoting and celebrating that kind of machismo and masculinity. And when you talk of justice in an unjust world, that is unjust in so many ways, right? And so, for instance, you are a mother of 2 kids living in Soweto. They have to be at school at 7, and you have to be up at 3 o'clock to get them ready, because if you don't get your transport at a particular time, you are not going to be able to get to work at the time that you are expected, and you might actually lose a salary because you're not on time. And that's how this economy is so brutal and violent to women, right? So what is the justice there when we accept that that is okay and acceptable for many women to live in that kind of environment and on a daily basis be subjected to this unfair world and that we're trying to make fair and humane? So that's one part. And the second part is the majority of women everywhere in the world are found in low-paying jobs, right? So where is the fairness and justice in that when you have someone making $1 billion during this pandemic and not finding it in themselves the injustice of refusing to pay a minimum wage, so that individual can make ends meet and be able to feed their family. So we I battle with this thing on a daily basis of what does it take for us as human beings to have compassion and empathy, and to name and the things that we see and address them with gusto and determination. And why is that the world still refuses to deal with the inequalities that we see, deal with the poverty levels that we see, the unemployment levels that we see, and we continue to put a bandage on a septic wound and hoping that it will heal, when instead we're supposed to take that wound and completely clean it inside and outside, so that then we can have a fresh start and have a reset on what kind of a just society and humane society we wish to have.
Yeah. So in terms of my thoughts on this, so I think what we've got to acknowledge is that having women in parliament in positions of power, it hasn't necessarily translated into effective change in the lives of women, predominantly Black women, particularly in South Africa. And I think we've seen that, the most clear example I can think of recently is how the government went and implemented the distress fund for COVID relief, and only 34% of the recipients were women, because there was a caveat that if you were a recipient of another child's social grant, you were not eligible to receive that distress grant. So, an aspect like that, it's almost a performative display of the government trying to show that they are trying to address the challenges and help the people. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it continues to perpetuate the unequal access to finance and the unequal access to opportunity and the unequal access to power that women then have to, grapple with in their daily lives. So yeah, I mean, I think it is quite interesting just in terms of there's, if you can't think of almost a single segment of society and culture where women aren't in some way negatively impacted or disadvantaged, either through policies that aren't necessarily as representative or intersectional as they need to be, or through, I don't know, in terms of the NSP particularly, and I speak about that predominantly because that was supposed to be a groundbreaking, corner turning, life changing plan that we were going to develop and implement. And, to this day, I can't necessarily guarantee that it's been 3 years and what has that change actually affected on the ground. Perhaps you'd know more about this, Brenda, in terms of legislation changes or.
So if you look at the NSP, and I mean, it's a culmination of many years of civil society organizations demanding change in how we address gender-based violence in this country. So we had many other policy frameworks and legislation to deal with gender-based violence, but that was not adequate because the scourge continued and continued unabated. And where we missed it was holding people accountable, whether it's at government level or at the police station or at the courts. We just did not hold those charged with the responsibilities of implementing these policy frameworks and legislation accountable. Now, so the NSP is a product of the 2018 total shutdown march, right? And what the beauty with that protest action was that it came from the ground and not the usual suspect of women who lead movements and lead protest action, right? So, and it resonated precisely because of that. And I remember the questions being asked, who's behind it? And our focus was that that's not important. What is important is rallying women around this common issue, which is gender-based violence. And we're saying to this government and decision makers that we don't have the luxury of lip service any longer. We want action. And that's what happened because civil society literally drove that process. It was not government that drove it. It was civil society. If it was not because of civil society, you would not have had the summit that led to that the drafting of the NSP. And that NSP, even itself, was literally drafted by civil society organizations because they needed to demonstrate to government how important this is and how urgent it is also, right? Now, remember, we conclude that work in we handed in the report in 2020 April and COVID hit, right? And typical government, as I suppose, once there's a pandemic, there's an excuse why things can't happen. And that's the travesty in all of this thing, that the implementation of the NSP took the back seat, right? And government has not even made the requisite resources available for its implementation. However, that has not stopped civil society from continuing to do the work. And because of that, we keep on exposing the ineptness and the ineffectiveness of government precisely because they have not come to the party and do what they're supposed to do. They continue to do their performative culture work that, like now it's Women's Month. I'm sure there will be a statement on how serious we take gender-based violence. It's all performative. It's and supported by clickbaits and all of that. But deep down, we have not gone deep into implementing that entire NSP with its 6 pillars, you know, to all our satisfaction. But what the position and the posture that we have taken is that we will do it ourselves. And I think when we developed it, we were very clear that it's not dependent solely on government. It requires 60 million South Africans to be part of its implementation. So I need to find my role in the 6 pillars, what I can do in changing gender and changing my attitude and my response towards GBV. Whether I decide that I can focus on prevention, others focus on research, others focus on economic power, others focus on care and response. So it means all of us have got a stake in its implementation and truly ridding our society of the scourge itself, but requiring a complete involvement of every single South African.
Brenda, thank you for that. I really do appreciate that, because it gives us a very useful insight of where we are at the moment with legislation as well as intervention strategies at the level of policy. And I think for me, it's interesting and useful to trace the debate back a bit, right? So in 1993, for instance, you have South Africa signing on to the Convention on the Political Rights of Women, right? And then in 1995, you have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And I want to take you to part 1 and 3 particular articles, right? So Article 2B, and if you'll just give me a second to scroll down to it, because I think it's quite important in the sense of the kind of history that I would like us to weave and stitch together here. So Article 2B says that this particular convention seeks to adopt appropriate legislative and other measures, including sanctions where appropriate, prohibiting all discrimination against women. And I think here in the first instance, I want to focus on this notion of sanctions, right? And of course, legislative sanctions as well, because, and I guess this is the first component of my entry point into this historical legislation around, the response that South Africa has given in terms of its intervention strategies. Are there adequate sanctions that we have legislated? Are there adequate sanctions that we have facilitated public discourse around, such that we create buy-in into a society that promotes the values that are enshrined in the Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women? Let's just start with that, and that's under Article 2B, and I'll take you to the other 2 articles that I'd like to focus on.
Yeah, so let's weave it. That's 1993. So what happens? What happens in 1994? We start to work on the Constitution, right?
Yes.
And we adopt that Constitution. I think 1996 we have the Constitution. The Constitution that has got a Bill of Rights. If you look at Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of the Constitution, it talks of the right to dignity, the right to safety and security, the right to life, and that no one should be discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation, age, gender, race, and all of that. So you've got a base in the form of a constitution, an important document that is paramount, that is the supreme law of the country, that almost everything that we do in this country must flow from that. Okay. Once we adopted that constitution, then we had to bring in legislation to support all of that, right? So when you talk of the right to dignity, the right to life, you had to then bring in legislation and policy frameworks to address equality, to address non-discrimination, to address gender-based violence. So I participated in the Termination of Pregnancy Act, because that's the one of the, once you adopted the constitution that tells me that I have got the right to choose as a woman, but I cannot determine what happens with this body of mine. I must get consent. I must get consent from my father, my husband, my brother, everybody else, then it's in conflict with the Constitution. You need to come up with legislation that gives a meaning to those clauses in the Constitution. So you then have the Termination of Pregnancy Act that gives women the right to decide whether to have an abortion or not. Because for the longest of time, we told women that they can't do anything. This body, I mean, you have other countries where the discussion on abortion is all men having a discussion about a woman's body, right? We were fortunate enough to be leading that. And as we moved along, we had to bring other pieces of legislation. So I'll take you through a number of those that were brought into the fore. You then brought in the Domestic Violence Act, and I'll talk briefly about the amendments that were introduced last year that are still being processed in Parliament. You looked at the Marriages Act. You remember for the longest time, women especially Black women in this country, once you married civilly, you were assumed to have been married out of community of property, right? So you don't have the benefits of in community of property. You don't have the benefits of entering into some contract. And customary law was not even recognized. So it left out as many Black women as including Muslim marriages, right? You've got the matter in the Constitutional Court at the moment on how you recognize Muslim marriages. And so because many of those women are denied benefits coming out of the marriage. So you've got the Marriage Act and the matrimonial property regime that regulates how you get married, and it has to be in line with the Constitution. That's why the changes that were introduced, the accrual system, but also that once I marry when I marry, I can decide whether I marry in community or with accrual. I'm no longer dictated to or forced to be in a particular regime, marriage regime. We move on to look at sexual offenses and harassment. So we come up with policies around sexual harassment and just sexual offenses in terms of the Criminal Procedure and the Criminal Amendment Act. Remember, an act of rape, for instance, is a crime against the state. And we have to have a provision of the law that regulates that crime, right? So you find it in criminal law, right? And once I'm a victim of rape, that case is now taken over by the state on my behalf, because the state acts on behalf of the people. They need to prosecute it to finality. And then we had to look at what are the prescribed sentences, minimum sentences that you must give to these transgressions. And for the longest of time, we realized that they were not adequate. And we had to ask ourselves the question, what is the purpose of punishment? Do we punish because we want to be retributive, reform, or deter? And I think it's a combination of all of that, right? So you then brought in the Domestic Violence Act, you brought the Customary Law Act, you brought Marriages Act, you matrimonial property regime, you brought in PEPUDA, the promotion of elimination of discrimination and all of that. So you keep on bringing legislation to support and ensure that once you violate my rights on the basis of my gender, I can then take action against anyone who does that. You have sexual harassment that is codified in the Labor Relations Act, and expecting that almost every organizations and employers have a sexual harassment policy in the workplace. We've just out of the ILO there's a new convention, Convention 190 on harassment and violence in the workplace, right? Now, countries must ratify that convention. We have not ratified, but at least in South Africa, domestically, we have a provision on how to deal with sexual harassment. So we have been evolving for a long time, but we realize that all these laws are not effective. They're not addressing the issue, or if they are addressing the issue, it's not adequate, and that's why the changes to the Domestic Violence last year, both Domestic Violence Act, the Criminal Amendment Act to deal with bail provisions. So what we've asked for, in this country, any gender-based violence that appear before the courts, there was this tendency to think that there's no need to apply to oppose bail. So you grant bail automatically, right? So the proposal that has been made was that the state must at all times, in all gender-based violence cases, oppose bail. It forces magistrates and prosecutors to look at gender-based violence cases differently. So it takes them out of their comfort because it was all a routine and habit that I walk into a court, there's a rape matter or a domestic violence matter, I just say, bail, oh, I agree to bail, 200 rand, I'm fine. So that's going to be a new provision that the state will at all times oppose bail in a gender-based violence. We also then looked at the sexual offense registry. That sexual offense registry used to only accommodate for children and people with mental challenges, right? So if I'm a principal at a school and you are applying for a job as a male teacher, I could approach the Justice Department and look at that register and see whether you are in that register or not, right? Then I can comfortably accept you as my employee. What we have proposed now is that you need to open that registry to include all sexual offenses, irrespective of whether it was on a child or a mentally challenged individual. So once a matter comes before a court and I'm raped, the perpetrator will appear on the sexual offense register, okay? And it then gives specifics on how you can get out of the register, and you have to conduct and behave in a particular way. But it now becomes public. Public meaning that any citizen who wants to verify the status of this particular individual can make a request and verify the details of that individual. So if you look at the Uyin and a matter quickly, the post office employee, once we said probing and questions were asked to the post office, did you, because it would seem it came out that this individual had a history of abuse, right? So if that register was open long time before, possibly that individual would have been in that register, would not have been employed by the post office, and maybe Uyin would have been saved from that, okay? And then we've also looked at bringing in cyber violence into the new amendments. We're making provision for doctors, social workers to report cases of domestic violence, right? So if I present at a hospital, the hospital doctor attending to me has got an obligation to report if they find that I've got bruises and they ask the right questions. For the longest, we tended to think that domestic violence is a private matter. We don't have to get involved, not any longer. So if you can see that since 1993, we have been trying to put legislative frameworks and policy frameworks to be able to support the advancement of women and to ensure that the discrimination does not happen. But, and I think is to the point, to the question that you asked earlier, what are the sanctions in a case where you have been discriminated against in a job or anywhere else? All these provisions have got a section on sanctions that must be applied once we find you to have violated my rights. But the challenge with all of these things is, one, how many of us know and understand the provisions of all these laws and policy frameworks, right? But also, it requires that you must have resources to be able to fight for your rights, right? And we all know that justice in this country is inaccessible and is expensive. So you have many victims of discrimination who have been silenced, not by anything else, but by the prohibitive, costly nature of this justice in this country that makes it impossible to utilize the very same rights that are given to you by the Constitution, that are your rights, but those rights you cannot access them because you don't have the resources to mount a challenge when they're being taken away from you. And I'll give you a quick example of a case that we have taken to the Constitutional Court that we are awaiting a judgment, which was done. We went into the Constitutional Court last year, February. It's a case of a woman who was gang raped in PE. She was walking along the beach. She gets accosted and dragged and raped in the bushes around in PE, in that particular beach section. Now, and she has written a book about her ordeal. She doesn't know finally how many days she was there, right? But once she came out, as she's walking towards her car, there's a couple that she meets, and the couple can see that there's something wrong. They then say, "Can we help you?" She says, "Can you just give me a phone?" And she remembered her mother's phone, and she called. The mother had already been to the police to find out if they could, because she had not seen her daughter, and she gets to know later that it was more than 2 days, right? To cut a long story short, the matter is reported to the police. The police now must investigate. Now, this is the tragedy with this whole thing. The police did not comb the area, did not do any fingerprinting. She had taken them there. She had shown them where but they didn't comb the area for any evidence, right? And she decided to sue the police for just being negligent in the execution of their duty, right? She wins the case in the PE High Court. What does the South African Police Service do? They appeal that decision. They go to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and Supreme Court of Appeal finds in the SAPS favor. That's why we took it to the Constitutional Court. What we're trying to demonstrate is that, and we have made the case strong in that if you walk into a police station in this country, there is a service charter that they've put on the wall. It tells you exactly what you should expect from a service from a South African Police Service, right? And we have used that against them, just to say this is the basic minimum standard that you are supposed to meet, and you fail to meet that basic minimum standard in this particular case. But now, can you imagine how many other women have been subjected to such and don't have the resources to mount a fight like this woman has done? So you take it from all the way from the High Court to the Supreme Court of Appeal to the Constitutional Court. And that's when you realize that these rights that we have, and even the policy frameworks and legislative frameworks that we have, are they just good being on paper and don't serve the interest of society, because you can't access this justice. And it's to find ways of making this justice and making these laws accessible and easy for people to enforce their rights at any given time.
Robin, I wonder if you've got a thought to share with us here, but as maybe you're sort of bringing your thoughts together, I'm a theoretician, Brenda. I work in a university, and as you're explaining the kind of historical trajectory that we have come, that we have traversed as South Africa, I'm reminded of two seminal feminist theorists, right? Martha Nussbaum's work on the capabilities approach, as well as Anne Cudd's work, right? When she talks about oppression and she analyzes oppression in very systematic form and in very systematic detail. And both of these theorists come to my mind because of the follow-up question I wanted to ask you, predicated on Article 3, that says that states, parties shall take in all fields, in particular in the political, social, economic, and cultural fields, all appropriate measures, including legislation, to ensure the full development and advancement of women for the purpose of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms on a basis of equality with men. And what the disjuncture you're showing us is to say, yes, we've got the paperwork, we've got the legislation. And of course, this is also predicated, I think, on the fact that South Africa and the South African legislative system has quite a high representation of women involved who are necessarily propositioning for these freedoms. But the question I have, I suppose, and I'm going to ask it again to both of you, how do we transcend the paper, right, in order to really bring into existence the kinds of worlds that Anne Cudd and Martha Nussbaum, for instance, are theorizing in their work when they talk about the kinds of capabilities that enable women to fulfill their absolute potentiality. I'm reading at the moment the Female Fear Factory by Phumla Kola. And in the introductory chapter, she says something she asks a very pertinent question. She says, what if she tells a story of a female student who comes to class and who says, I've already had to wage 1,000 battles before coming to this lecture at 9 a.m. in the morning. And Phumla asks a very interesting question. She says, what if this young lady, this young woman, didn't have to wage all of those battles? How much more could she be able to bring of herself to the intellectual project, to her own capabilities, if she didn't have the imminent violence always and forever threatening her? So the question, I suppose, in very simple terms, is to say, how do we transcend the legislative framework, which is beautiful, to really begin actualizing a society that facilitates women tapping into their full capabilities and realizing their truest potentialities, not only in South Africa, but taking South Africa as an example across the globe as well? I wonder if both of you might have a response for that.
I'm going to defer to.
So I suppose I do want to launch into it somewhat anecdotally. So when I was 18, I was raped and felt at that time already that the services, the police force, the judicial system, the legal system, whatever, there was no option for me to go there. There was no potential for it to bring me anything, because I was very fortunate to be raised in a very privileged house. I had parents who put me through education, and so there were definitely aspects that I thought put me in a better stead to cope with that without needing to go the legal route. What I came to realize as that slowly destroyed me in various ways, shapes, and forms is that there is absolutely a need for us to harbor and build a space where victims are able to turn to the structures that we've put in place, the legislature, the people who are working to help them. We absolutely need to find ways to encourage that and to develop a culture where that is promoted and encouraged. And to my dismay, what I had to this year go through the process of going to the Randburg Magistrates Court in order to get a protection order against a man who was harassing me online. And what upset me is that I felt like everything that I had feared when I was raped at the age of 18 was confirmed for me in the experience of simply trying to get a protection order however many years later. And it was everything from, I had to go to the police station in order to get some of my statements verified. And there were 3 women in the queue in front of me. And only one of them got help, because the first woman, the policeman said, until he actually does something to you, we can't help you. So she turned away with no one helping her. The second woman, she walked in, she said, I'd like to open a case. And they said, I'm sorry, without the man's identity number, we can't help you. And so she also left with no one helping. Eventually, the third woman begrudgingly received help from this policeman. And it just enraged me, because these women, it's not easy for women for various reasons: economic, geographic, family pressure, culture. It's not easy for women to go to police stations or anywhere in order to seek help. But they were trying, and 2 out of 3 were turned away. Then when we got to the Randburg Magistrates Court, firstly, also reporting digital offenses such as harassment online. If you don't get a police officer who's going to laugh at you, you do get one who turns around and says, just so you know, if he does continue, there's not much we can do, especially if he continues to create fake profiles in order to do it. So already we're acknowledging that while there is this beautiful infrastructure, there are ways and means in which it does fall short of the rapidly changing world in which we exist. And that is, it's by no fault of the people who've written the legislature, because it almost seems as if the nefarious ways in which people are attacking and harassing each other and finding ways to attack and harass each other are just ever evolving. And so it is difficult to kind of respond to that in the moment. But, it reinforced for me that gap between the legislature, the beautiful constitution that we have, and the actual on the ground experience. And the final nail in this coffin of, sort of inspiring despair in me was I had to put my residential address onto the protection order with all the evidence and everything. And my lawyer at the time said to the woman, we would like to have it redacted, because we need to protect her, where she lives. And the court clerk said, no, that's not possible. That's not how it's done. Now, there are provisions where in a gender-based violence case, domestic abuse case, you can remove that, because you don't want to be giving people who are in the harassing, you don't want to give them someone's residential address on a platter. And the clerk refused. She said, if we removed my residential address, we would not be able to submit the protection order to the court. So it was this kind of realization as well that we have to approach, to Brenda's point about there needing to be millions of people who are all working towards this. It literally has to be every touch point of society, not only that the victims will engage with, but that women engage with from the minute they're born. And it's going to take a societal and a cultural overhaul, from the way companies do business to the way that certain people are raised within the traditional family structure, addressing the traditional role of women, like we've spoken about, and also looking at ways in which we can empower women to be more economically active. So, yeah.
And Brenda, before you come in, I want to take you to Article 5A now, because this is going to segue quite nicely as well, I think, into our discussion over the weekend. And Article 5A reads that it is state parties shall take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men. And I want to underscore that, this idea of the social and cultural conduct of men and women, with a view of achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotyped roles of men and women. And I wonder whether the function of socio-cultural engineering becomes part and parcel of a social democrat project, maybe, right? Through the kinds of visual literacies that we are engaged in educating, civil action, as you're talking about, which is to say, the NSP becomes a project that is driven not by the state, not by government, but at grassroots level. And I'm fascinated with the social engineering component of the conduct, specifically the social and cultural conduct of men, in order for us to reimagine society, and whether that is possible, Brenda.
Oh man, I think you it's Friday, don't forget, right? So don't be hard on us, right? Listen, I think it's possible if we put our minds to it. It is possible. And it's possible if it's done in the most and I want the word for it, non-accusatory way, okay? Because I've seen that once we have a discussion around women's oppression and discrimination and gender-based violence, most men feel attacked, and they believe that is an attack on them, right? So they don't give themselves time to take the information, marinate on it, and digest it, and then respond. So they respond with anger because they think that they're being attacked because of their privilege. So I think it's possible, and and we've been doing baby steps to engage with different men's organizations to educate and to bring into sharp focus the issues of women and how they are prejudiced and how the bias manifests itself in the place of work, at home, in church, at university, in the schools, all of it. And so let's talk about this and talk about the oppression and the capability approach, as per the feminist writers that you referred to earlier. If my socialization as a Black woman in this country has been that I do not matter, that I don't have a voice, that my looks, how I speak, how I sit is scrutinized, and that society has actually carved my life, and they've decided that what I'm good for is to find a man whom I must marry and bear children for, and continue the legacy of this family and the family name. And that's my socialization. Grew up with being told that even education is not important, but you will get education. But remember that even if you have the education, the ultimate prize is for you to be in a marriage and have children. And in that marriage, you also don't have a voice because the man is the decision maker of the household, right? Mm-hmm. Equally, a young man is socialized the same way, socialized to believe that they have the power on me to do as they please with me, right? Tradition has bestowed on them this power of being the head of a family, right? And that must continue throughout, no matter what. Their word is final, whether it's in a home or anywhere else. So we carry all of these things. When we leave our homes, we take them into our workspaces. We take that into our political lives. We take them into any other space that we find, because that's what I know That's my frame of reference, is the men and women that I've seen in my life and how they conduct themselves and behave, and how tradition and customs and cultural practices have been used to, one, to give me this privilege that I have as a man, but subjugate a woman. So the oppression starts from birth, because as women, as we give birth already, as I birth a girl, I know that I'm birthing a flower that I must protect, and protect against all sorts of things, and nurture this flower to bloom into something beautiful that will then be taken over by someone who will look after it. Okay. And as a man, I grow up with a sense of control, of power, because I'm in charge, and I have seen fathers, uncles in my family behaving as such, and that being okay to exert the power over another human being. And as I said, we continue to take that into our respective spaces wherever we are. And that's why you have leadership that struggles. I have been at the CCMA where a commissioner will struggle to say sexual harassment because it made him uncomfortable. But you're a commissioner given the responsibility to adjudicate on a sexual harassment matter. You cannot say the word, right? You have leaders of society who struggle to reconcile how violence manifests in their homes, in their churches, and they will like to separate all of that and not see them as interconnected, right? So, you know, there's a saying that our experiences make us who we are, and it is very difficult to get us out of that experience that has made us to believe for the longest of time that this is who I am. So I keep on saying that yes, it is possible to change men, also to change women, because we keep on believing that we are second-class citizens, and we must accept that we can be violated, because that's how it has been done for centuries, right? So it's a lot of civic work that must be done, and that civic work cannot just be, and I've said it, you cannot look at gender-based violence or violence against women in isolation of everything else, right? The economy, health, education, all of it is interconnected. So as long as we continue to look at violence singularly and isolated from all the other variables and factors, you're going to have challenges when we address violence. People then get agitated and violent and think that they're being attacked. So we need to find entry points for violence when you are discussing the economy, and demonstrate why, once you do not, once you bring in austerity measures, what those austerity measures will do to those vulnerable who are in the caring economy, and the impact of those austerity on all of them. What education, if you insist that we must all be in class by 7 o'clock when I have to take 3 taxis to get to that school, what that means, and so it's all interconnected, and we need to find different entry points so that the men who are privileged and continue to be privileged by the system and the structures of power can understand why it's important to relinquish that power. Yeah.
Just as a sort of final and concluding thought, again, as you're chatting, I'm reminded of two incredible scholars. I'm reminded of Toni Morrison's work, right?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
In 1993, when she's giving the Nobel lecture for the literary award, and she talks about the concept of language, right?
Oh, yeah.
And she talks about how we, through language, create and imagine our worlds.
Oh, yeah.
Similarly, in that exact same kind of time, Zoe Wickham here at home, although she's based in Scotland, a South African intellectual, a literary thinker, is also thinking about this question of words and ideas and what it is that words begin to do in fashioning the democratic society. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds, 30 seconds to a minute, both of you, to say, on this Friday afternoon, as I think we've had a really rich and really, really incredible conversation, what is it that you both wish for and hope for the future of South Africa and the possibilities inherent in how we create our worlds through our language, through our visual representations of this country, and the imaginaries that we can release? Because I think we've been arrested by a nightmare for a very long time. What possibilities, what dream can we have for South Africa in terms of imagining new possibilities? Brenda, I see you're still musing over that thought. So let me start with you, Robert.
Robert,
Let me start with you. What's your thought?
Number one, could we please have a Black female president? No, it's not that simple. So it's quite interesting, you know, as Brenda was talking and as you were talking now, I think part of, I'm trying to also tie it into the concept of social democracy and why that appeals to me. And one of the kind of foundational points of social democracy is solidarity. And that definitely speaks to me about the concept of it will take all of us. And as much as there are these feminist icons and these women who are blazing the trail in terms of getting us to where we need to go, there does need to be the invitation extended to men in order for them to not only recognize their power, because there does also need to be a concession of power. Women fought for the vote, but it wasn't until men agreed to give it that it was given. That fight would have continued. There does need to be some aspect of recognizing the need to concede the power. And yeah, so I think it's about engendering and understanding that every single one of us has a role in this fight. And it's not a women's problem. It's our problem. It's a national crisis. And it's something that is going to take all of us to erase. And so definitely, I think it's about understanding not only the power that we have within our own personal capacity to play a role in the NSP, which also included rebuilding social cohesion as part of its plan. So I think that also ties into the aspect of solidarity. But it's going to take all of us. And I think until we recognize that, we are going to have an uphill battle where incredible people like Brenda are going to work themselves to death, trying to make the difference that we should all be trying to make.
Brenda?
Thank you. I mean, I think, Robin, you solidarity. And you know, if I had it my way, I would do away with politics and structures of elections and whatnot. But you know, that's another conversation for another day, and especially in how we see it in this country as a vehicle to amassing wealth and stealing from the fiscus. So because what we have done, and I suppose it's part of the work that you are doing as African, the alliance, the Democratic Alliance. I must get the name of the organization correct, right? What's the full name?
The Alliance of Social Democrats.
So the Alliance for Social Democrats. In my existence, you know, the 50 years, one thing that I can say this country needs and needs it urgently is civic education. Because once we do that, we will have a populace that will be able to ask the right questions and demand accountability. And once you have that populace that can ask the right question and demand accountability, you start to see the shift in how things happen and how we start to shape a society that is based on rules of integrity, ethical conduct and behavior, and empathy and kindness.
Brenda, I'm gonna. Can I ask you to pause it there, because I think that that's such a brilliant space for us to continue the conversation on Sunday around, well, what is it practically, right, that we can begin to do? You know, both yourself and Robin give us some interesting suggestions around this idea of transcending what can be understood as the high corridors of power and beginning really to get into the grassroots level through solidarity and through civic education. And thank you very much to you, Brenda, for joining us as ASD this afternoon. For those who are watching, Brenda Madumise is a legal consultant with over 25 years experience in business development, operations, strategic planning, and transformation, in addition to leading an investment company focusing on mining, PPPs, financial services, and hospitality. She also served as the chairman of various organizations, boards, including but not limited to Business Unity South Africa. I don't know how to pronounce that one, CATHSSETA. In
it was a CETA that was a cultural and tourism and travel CETA.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes. As well as railway safety regulator. And really, Brenda, we thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Robin Porteous and I will have you again joining us on Sunday evening for another conversation.
Yeah, hopefully I will not have had a lot of champagne on Sunday, right? At 6 o'clock.
Champagne is always
and I can promise you this much: on Sunday, it's going to be a lot less easier. It's going to be a lot less chilled. It's not going to be this like intensely high convoluted discussion that we had today around all of these intense things. So thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you for good facilitation. You made it very easy for us, right? So I'll prepare for Sunday, definitely.
We look forward to it so much.
Okay. Thank you, Robin.
Have a good rest of your Friday. Go have some wine.
Yeah, I'm going to try. Palisa, thank you very much. Merci, Reto.
Yes.
Thanks to you, Brenda. We are honored.
No, thank you very much. Thank you.
We look forward to Sunday. Thank you.
Sunday, yes. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Take care.